Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Paty Paliokosta, Danielle Farrel, Leah O'Toole, Silva Cappello, and Irati Sagardia-Iturria will talk about navigating inclusive educational transitions for all.
What do we mean by transitions?
Yeah, so we have to bear in mind that when we are talking about transition, we are talking about change from one context to another one. And these changes have been explained through different disciplines. One of them is anthropology, and from this discipline, it has been explained that they are the different phases that we go throughout our life. So an example could be from our childhood to our adolescence, and from our adolescence to our adulthood. Another discipline is psychology. From a psychological perspective, the ecological system have been important to understand transitions. And to explain it in a simple way, if we take into account that the child is in the center, it explains that how the contextual layers, the different contextual layers, depending on what kind of relationship they have a big impact on the child's development, learning, roles, and identities. From a sociological perspective, an important term could be social capital of Bourdieu, because he explained how the culture can reproduce advantages or disadvantages on educational achievement. So, for example, if a family has a certain cultural social capital, this can help to have resources, to have some kind of skills, and other children, for example, because of a different social capital, can experience some difficulties in adapting to that kind of social capital.
Can you talk about transition in relation to education?
Yeah, so many authors have also explained the transitions in education, and I think that when we think about transition, we all think about the vertical transitions that are the ones that we have to do throughout our academic process. And these ones would be, for example, from home to school, from early childhood to primary education, from primary education to secondary education. But there are also horizontal transitions that are, as an example, would be everyday life transitions that are also important in order to understand the transitions as a process and as a whole, because this one would be, for example, the changes that we carry out from home to school, or when we are at school, for example, from a class setting to the playground. This also involves a process and a change that the child has to adapt. Also, some years ago, when we were talking about transition, we used to talk about the child readiness. And in this, when we focus transition in this way, we are giving the responsibility to adapt to the child. But nowadays, this focus has changed, and we are talking more about the school and community readiness, because we understand that it has to be the context who has to adapt to the child and family, and not in the other way around. Because if we are talking about inclusion, it makes sense to change our context in order to make those educational transitions successful for all. Through these transition processes, we have to think also that the individual is going through external and internal changes. And the external ones would be the changes that they experience because of the context. So the new peers, the new teachers, the new settings, the new relationships that are building. And the internal ones would be, because of that contextual changes, how the individual is developing how his or her identity is building in that new context, what are the different roles that are experiencing, and yes, how it's developing. In order to have these successful transitions, we think that it's important to create inclusive culture, policies and practices, because we also have to think that all these transitions will have an impact on that individual, and if they are experiencing negative transitions, this will have an impact in further transitions and also in their well-being. So, yeah.
What are the key aspects of transition?
Well, I would say that some of them, four of them, for example, would be that it's a change, that when we are talking about change, we are understanding it as an ongoing process, not as an one-off event. And in order to, as we mentioned before, in order to make that transition successful, it's important to do it in a smooth way. So continuity will be the second important key aspect. And when we talk about continuity, we are talking about the pedagogical continuity, about the relationships that it's important to maintain their friends, because it is a research that it's important for their achievement and well-being. And also we are talking about the school culture, because for example, when they change from early childhood to primary education, the school culture is completely different. So yeah, and in order to ensure that continuity, coordination would be another important aspect, because if the different settings are not coordinated, they won't know what are the needs of the children, and they cannot ensure that smooth change. I would say that the fourth important aspect, and for me it's crucial, it's to listen to all children and families, because if we are talking about inclusion, I think that their participation is crucial, and giving them a voice will have a clear understanding of what are their experiences and their needs, and in that way listening to them will have the notion of understanding the whole process, and also will have the opportunity to give what they need, to respond to their needs. So transitions are complex. Are there particular groups at risk of ineffective transitions?
So transitions are, and successful transitions, is a very complex thing. There are so many parameters associated with transitions, and it is a life event, not just a one-off event. So it is congruent to other complexities that exist within systems and within people. So it is very complex for all, but particularly so for school populations that might be at risk of marginalization and who can face systemic barriers that relate to factors such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, language proficiency, disability, geographical location. And these are some examples only of the differences that people might be experiencing that can affect their successful transitions. But the important thing is that these populations may disproportionately face limited access to quality education, to quality services, to quality support that would otherwise support them with transition, and that can lead to poor educational outcomes and disparities in relation to other school populations. The challenges that we primarily see, obviously there are different transitions that people go through, but if for this discussion focus just on the vertical transitions and from one stage, for example, to the other, this is where we find big issues being identified. And it's important when we're looking at particular populations that might be marginalized to look at this from an intersectional lens, from an intersectional point of view. What do we mean by intersectional point of view? It's a relationship between the individual characteristics that people have and the social characteristics, the societal characteristics that interplay with these individual characteristics at a given point in time, maybe at this given transition. And it's really important not to look at people's needs in isolation, but realize that it's the systemic barriers or the systemic circumstances, because it might not be barrier, it might be facilitator in some cases, that will actually lead to certain inequalities. So intersectionality is not about identity so much and about the interplay of different identities, but it is about the interplay of power relations between what exists around the person who is going through particular points of transition.
So what are the barriers to successful transitions?
So there are particular systemic barriers that can make transitions unsuccessful within the educational kind of sector. And it's really important to look at unequal education systems that can operate, that can present people with barriers when transitioning from educational stages. These barriers stem from inequalities within the educational opportunities, such as limited access to inclusive classrooms, individualized support through individual educational plans, appropriate accommodations and reasonable adjustments that need to be available, often by law and international and local laws in particular countries, that then would facilitate the person's ability to actually be included within their school environment. These factors can significantly affect the ability to transition smoothly within education environments, and they relate more with the system than with the person, as we cannot be expecting everyone to have the same needs and the same approaches to learning. And it is really, really important to realize that if we're talking about equal opportunities and about equity, we need to be making some changes. We need to be offering this additional or different support that will then enable people to access their entitlements. For example, if there is a lack of appropriate coursework, say in primary school, and particular accommodations and individual education plans that really support educators to meet children's needs and for them to reach their potential, it can make the transition to secondary really difficult. Or if the needs are not identified, sometimes we find some children maybe have communication difficulties that have not been identified early on, and then these needs are unmet. They do not manage to have a fulfilling educational experience, and then they end up maybe going to secondary and exhibiting different needs and being identified as having emotional and behavioral difficulties only because their transition was not meaningful, careful, and appropriate for them to then just calmly go, to the education environment. They would be, they would feel accepted and represented in. Multidisciplinary networks and support networks in general are really important in these transition processes because educators in schools at different levels cannot really do everything on their own. This is a systemic issue, as we explained, so it's beyond the individual. And we need to create sustainable practices that are supporting both the learner and the teacher to navigate actually those moments. It is very important to have all these networks as well and multidisciplinarity in order to create a particular, if we're talking for example, from the point of view of disability and the need of maybe augmentative support, software, screen readers, communication devices, and so on. It is really, really important to have some connection to expert input, not taking a medical point of view regarding disability, but really enabling teachers to actually create an accessible learning experience for their children. Something that we sometimes forget in terms of systemic things and in terms of equal opportunities, and for example, how ready a family might be to enter education for the child to go to primary school, for example, is an equal services distribution within geographical spaces. A child maybe from a rural area might have limited access to services again, and we need to take that into consideration as we sometimes think of like bigger issues in terms of migration or people who are on a refugee status, but we are also forgetting like smaller transitions that and relating to social capital that people might be experiencing. So it's really, really important to think when children are and young people are transitioning from one point to the other, to the next, to see how they are represented and how we do not take for granted particular aspects. And that links really to a point of view of discrimination that we might be creating and bias in our approaches towards learners. A lack of inclusive culture and understanding of diversity, combined with limited resource allocation that I've already mentioned, can lead to discriminatory and conscious and unconscious bias, which means that sometimes without realizing we are excluding people from participating in education experiences and in meaningful transitions because we are thinking in a very particular way about what a learner's needs are, what school is about, and what prior experiences might be for people. This is, I've mentioned early years in primary. I think it is really, really important to also think about learners moving from secondary education to higher education, where again a lot of unconscious bias interplays in the process, even from the point of view even of the person in terms of decision making, what they feel they can do or not do, but also from the other side where the university has certain expectations, certain ways of judging students' work, and really the disparities again present maybe based on socioeconomic status or opportunities people had already. Of course, you can also talk about, campus readiness. Are there the accessible, physically accessible environments, but also emotionally and socially accessible environments for our students who might have intersectional needs, and they need different accommodations and also some support to kind of find themselves within the system. And it's really, really important for people to be able to see themselves in the learning experience, in the curricula, and so on. And finally, some connection could be made here from the point of view of employment, where again there can be a lot of discriminatory attitudes when people are in transition from either university to employment or from secondary education to employment, and really look at what negative judgments might be made by prospective employers in relation to differences that these learners might have and these people that belong to these possibly marginalized groups. And last but not least, just to mention culture and the linguistic barriers that may also be on interplay alongside other differences that people bring. Especially, again, we are at turbulent times across the world, but also in Europe. So it's really, really important to think about what additional challenges people might face due to language and being able to represent their knowledge, their background, and so on. So again, this is really, really relevant alongside the cultural perspectives as a barrier facilitator from really early years all the way up to university and beyond.
So are there theories that can explain the barriers to successful educational transitions?
Yeah, there are multiple theories that one could connect to education transitions because of the fact that so many also different parameters are involved. So it's really sometimes even about choice. But the very straightforward one would be Brenner's ecological systems theory, as there are so many different factors involved, stages, and people around educational transitions and beyond. There is also a social constructivist theory that would relate to education transitions, because we can see that there are different perspectives that can be taken when we're looking at it's about the person and how they're constructed within the context and the environment and the particular sociocultural perspective. And this actually connects us to cultural responsiveness theory, which is about really connecting with the person, what they bring, and how can we then create that school readiness, institution readiness that we're trying to actually develop when we're striving for successful transitions. There are other theories as well, like trauma response theory, especially again if we're thinking about difficult and traumatic situations that people may have been involved in the process of transition or before, but they carry it with them, it's part of their story, and is how do we take this into consideration when we're creating those accommodations that we're trying to create. So in this context, we are focusing a little bit more on Brenner in combination with the cultural responsiveness theory, and it's important to look at the multiple systems that influence a person's development, including the microsystem, which is like the immediate environment, it's the person, their own needs, but also this can be seen in different ways. The family can be looked at as part of the microsystem, and then we have the mesosystem, where there are interactions of different environments. So the nursery, for example, could be, or the kindergarten, according to the way different countries describe this. And then there is the exosystem with indirect influences that come through discourses, through languages through language people use when they are describing the social situations that are there, or the practical things that are happening, you know, in those transitions. And then there is the macro level, the macro system, with all the cultural and societal influences, and that's where we can combine the sociocultural perspective and the cultural responsiveness, because without that, we're expecting someone to just adjust to a new environment that does not relate with them at all. So we hope that then this kind of thinking and applying these theories can help you as educators to recognize, you know, the impacts of various interventions that support the holistic support for children and young people in transition, and connect the multiple systems together, and all under a perspective of relationships, which is a key aspect when we're looking at the different stages of, if you look at Brenner's, you know, example as those homocentric circles, and you start from the middle and go outwards, every stage needs to be connected with the other and include relationships with them, and then a relational pedagogy, a relational perspective. Hopefully this, in combination with culturally responsive approaches, can incorporate students' cultural backgrounds, experiences, identities, and create an inclusive and supporting environment during transitions, and hopefully beyond, across their education experience. So considering there are so many factors involved in terms of successful transitions, what might be some factors that would support educators in not being overwhelmed by this process?
Yeah, okay, so drawing on what Paty has just said there, and what others have talked about in relation to transitions, I think what we can see is that they're really, really complex. And I suppose from the perspective of an educator, it's very easy to become very overwhelmed by that and to think, well, I can't control, let's say, whatever policy has come down from a Department of Education. I can't control how my government are treating migrants. I can't control, there's so much there that you can't control. So it'd be very easy, I think, for educators to become so overwhelmed that they disengage and think there's nothing I can do to help. So, drawing on what you said, Paty, about theoretical perspectives, I think that's where they can be really helpful in encouraging us to be able to hold all those factors in mind and make sense of them and ensure that they're coherent, and not end up in that position where you feel there's nothing I can do. So, drawing on what you said around Bronfenbrenner's work, I find his later work really, really useful because he talks about the idea of process, person, context and time all being taken into account when we consider what needs to happen for a positive transition to happen. So, to talk about those briefly, starting, let's say, with the person element, we've talked a lot in terms of inclusion about how different elements like culture or disability or, socioeconomics, a variety of different dimensions of diversity can impact on the way we experience a transition. So, for example, if we think of an autistic child starting in a new setting, change is really hard, and that's going to make it even more difficult for this particular individual. Or if I'm a child who the language of instruction in the educational setting is different than the language I speak at home, that transition is going to be more difficult. But what I really like about Bronfenbrenner's work is that he doesn't locate the responsibility for support and change within just the person, but rather it's all located within the context as well. So, you mentioned, Paty, this idea of the mesosystem, and I think that's really powerful because what it looks at is the kind of linkages we can create in mesosystems, moving from one microsystem to another. So, going back to that autistic child, is there the same person who meets them every morning at the door? Maybe a key worker approach, or in a primary setting, maybe an SNA, so that that child knows what to expect. That linkage is formed. Or for the child who comes into an educational setting with a different language than the one that's spoken there, is this seen in a deficit way of, he or she doesn't speak English, for example, or is it seen in a far more culturally attuned way? This is, maybe that child doesn't speak English, but they do speak Russian and, Romanian and, 4 other languages. Does the child see themselves when they come to the educational setting? Are they visible? Are there dolls who look like me in the early childhood setting? Are there books in the primary setting or the secondary setting that talk about people who are like me and my family? So the context is hugely important. Do we create linkages for people in their transition, or do our structures erect disjunctures and difficulties for people to make those transitions? So that's person and context. Then Bronfenbrenner talks about the idea of time, and that can be your personal time or it can be the more socio-historical piece. So, for example, there's a lot of research that shows that very much younger children find it much harder to transition to primary school. So in Ireland, for example, traditionally children could transition to primary school as early as the age of 3, so that's really very young. For a long time, the age was around, most children went at 4. And over time that's changed a little now because there's governmental paid early childhood education, free preschool years. So now most children are 5 going, and that kind of makes life a little bit easier. It's just that little bit easier all the way up, and then the child hits that transition to secondary school that little bit more older and capable, and equally the other end, out into the transition into 3rd level or out into work. So it can be the personal time. Equally, it can be that socio-historical piece. So to give you an example, my little boy went to preschool one Thursday, came home, and then never saw his preschool teacher again because the world shut down with the global pandemic, So his transition then into primary school was really tough because a lot of the time he was, there were lockdowns, he was being homeschooled, it wasn't a straightforward transition for him. So the time that this happens in, we need to take into account. And going back to this point about how overwhelmed we can become as educators, like there's so many different factors that are all going to combine and in an intersectional way impact on individual experiences. But I think what's really powerful about this PPCT model is the first P, which is process. I'm talking about it last, but actually Bronfenbrenner puts it first, and it refers to relationships. So you mentioned this already, Paty, about the power of relationships. And what we have found in research and in practice is that that's what makes the change. So Bronfenbrenner was famously asked, you know, what do children need for optimal development? And, you know, people expected him to say something about policy or about early childhood education or, you know, something like that. And very famously he answered that somebody has to be crazy about the kid. So what he meant by that was that, you know, an adult needs to really genuinely, deeply care about the child for development to be at its optimal level, and that really applies to transitions. So if we have an adult in the educational setting who cares that the child does well, who sees that maybe behaviour is a form of communication, that I'm finding this transition hard rather than something to be controlled, you know, who's on the side of the child and the family, that's really what makes the difference. So, I mean, we can think about all the complex approaches to encouraging positive transitions like the passports or the, you know, the different kind of strategies. But I think what's really important for educators to remember that underlying all of these strategies is what makes them work is actually the relationships. You know, the kindness, the empathy, the understanding of the child or the student and their life outside of the setting. That's what's going to work really well towards positive transitions.
Thank you so much. That is actually really relevant, really important to talk about that continuity in terms of relationships. Yeah. And what has been found as well is that equally as in early years that you mentioned in primary and secondary, we have found that we need to be really aware regarding students' entry to higher education, and now strategies based on relational pedagogy are really, really important and emphasized. And, you know, providing early tutor support, for example, early on and in a transitional way as well, especially also and particularly for students that might be belonging to marginalized or potentially marginalized groups. And I think something that is important mentioning within those contexts is the ability to use data-informed material as well in order to kind of be a bit prepared. But fully agree that it's really, really important to establish those relationships and think about the purpose of schooling again and again and again. Why are we here? What is our mission? And maybe again, Paulo Freire could also be, you know, one of our guides about, you know, responding to everyone's needs, think about oppression, tackle oppression through education, and look at things from their point of view, really, as much as we can through empathy.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial. And, you know, you mentioned that relationship with parents as well and with families. So it's like the child doesn't exist in isolation. They're living within their families within their communities, their cultures. And so the educational setting needs to really foreground those relationships, those wider relationships too. And it's funny, I mean, for example, we did a piece of work a few years ago for our National Council for Curriculum and Assessment in Ireland and our National Parents Council to look at what were the strategies that worked really well in building those connections with families. And I think the funders maybe hoped that we would say things like, oh, have your parent-teacher meeting in October, or use a certain app, or use, and actually the key finding was that the strategies didn't really matter. What really mattered was the relationships that underpinned them.
And the culture, and then they reinforce the culture, which is so important, isn't it?
So in terms of transitions and inclusion, then it's not so hard for the student or the child to move from their life to their educational setting.
So Danielle, could you share your perspective of transition in education from your lived experience of disability?
Yeah, no problem. I have experience of both mainstream schooling and special education schooling. I attended a mainstream primary school. Obviously I was really young at that point, but I know from speaking to my parents that they had a bit of a challenge to get me a place at the local mainstream primary school because the education department believed that my disability would disrupt the class. But by the time I came to secondary education, I decided with the support of my parents to move into special education for my secondary school education, and I obtained my qualifications. But the reason why I decided to make that move was if I stayed in mainstream, I believe that there would have been access issues because there was on a one-day visit to the mainstream secondary school, and I believe that I wouldn't have been able to get the qualifications that I did obtain. But after completing secondary school, I decided to make a big transition again and go back into mainstream education for college and university. I managed these transitions with the support of my parents and my self-determination, but on reflection, I think that these would have been easier if people who were involved in supporting me had actually asked what I needed in these transitions in terms of support to help me achieve what I have achieved.
How does person-centered planning and self-determination relate to school transition?
In a big way. So person-centered planning, for anyone who doesn't know about the key principles of it, person-centered planning removes the barriers that disability often brings and looks at a person's dream, puts them at the centre of the plan throughout, but it starts by looking at the person's dream and then often working backwards to help the person look at how they will achieve their dream. So it might be that somebody can't achieve all their dream. I remember an example I was given during my training was that a young person wanted to be a pilot, and due to his disability, this wasn't going to be achievable as a whole dream. So what the person-centered planning process did for him was it dug a bit deeper, and through a conversation they found out that he liked the idea of helping people and wearing a uniform. So the outcome was this young man ended up working in the airport. He wasn't a pilot, but he wore a uniform and he helped people. So he was able to achieve an aspect of his dream. And from that, I think it's clear that person-centered planning allows people to dream big. It allows them to be asked questions like, what is important to you and for you? Because often disabled people are asked these questions as one question, when actually what is important to you and for you are two very different questions. And person-centered planning should be done at different stages of a person's life. It's not a task that is done once and then should be forgotten about. It should be done continuously and allow people to transition through life, just like non-disabled people. Disabled people, their aspirations will change and grow as they do, and the misconception of transition is often that it begins and ends when somebody leaves school. This is not the case. As I've just said, life changes, people's goals and aspirations change, and person-centered planning moves with the person and allows for this to happen. So what are some general examples that would be useful in all stages of transition?
Well, there are several different approaches into supporting transitions for different age groups and stages for children and young people. There are several bridging programs that can help students, young learners, individuals to go through transition points in their school careers or in their kind of lifespan within their learning process. But what we really need to remember when we're thinking about different programs and approaches is that there are certain systemic barriers that these approaches need to take into consideration. They're trying to really tackle. So in order to actually create a smooth transition for those who might otherwise be at risk of marginalization. When we're thinking about the individuals that are in transition, you know, it could be young children in early years going to primary education or from home to early years, and we need to think in a holistic way. We need to take into consideration socio-emotional interventions, academic support that they might need as they go up the stages, but also use community resources effectively and multidisciplinarity. When we're thinking about disability, for example, and the person-centered planning approach, it's so important to actually ensure we have access as educators, that we are linking with the right people, we're asking the right questions, and we're thinking of who do we have on the table, and how can we elicit voices of the individuals that might otherwise become marginalized. And that is a key thing about voice, because young children, very young children, might not be able to share voice in a meaningful, maybe for us, way, but they know their needs. The families need to be really involved, and certain linguistic barriers need to be taken into consideration, language, sociocultural issues, the heritage that people bring with them. So there is a combination, an intersectional way in which we need to, we can address those transition issues in terms of strategies. And the parental involvement is key and needs to be in, as part of many of the interventions that are there available. I mean, internationally there are different titles, they are different, but they are all under kind of the same principle, hearing the voice of the person, involvement, co-production, meaningful co-production where people are involved, even if they are non-verbal. There are ways of actually representing people's needs, desires, aspirations in pictorial ways or in ways they choose to contribute, in order then to make their wishes understood, so that this can be taken into consideration within transition processes. And something that is really key in the context of this kind of work with people who can be oppressed, who can be marginalized, is to use what we call relational pedagogy. So ensure that we have the tools to create those relationships that will then lead to that meaningful listening, meaningful co-production, meaningful planning.
Yes, so there are these approaches to support individuals and create a net within schools with this combination between person-centered planning and self-determination principles. And these approaches could be promoted by a process of co-design or co-production with the aim to support people with disabilities and their families at an early stage in a life path and transitions without predictable and pre-organized options, allowing instead them to live the life they would like in a more articulated and complex way. With this approach, it's possible to support people in various aspects and transitions of their life without pre-established and pre-organized options, but allowing them to control their own existence and with decisions and with some opportunities to imagine their future. And in this way, there is no longer someone who directs and fits individual into rigid and pre-selected context and options, while there is the possibility to change the role of educator in a different way, because it's different from the care model that is based on reduced options and pre-selection of the opportunities, while with this approach, the co-design or co-production is possible to offer a service for people with disabilities and their families, where the educators can be only one point of view and could be only give some advice and suggestions to the family in order to help them in a decision-making process where the role of educators, it's only one perspective. So there are several perspectives, and the role of the educator is only one point of view. So through the co-design approach, it's concretely possible to help and to support people with disabilities or individuals in general in their life project with different educational transitions.
So in terms of some more detail in relation to some approaches you may come across in your practice, and these are examples from different countries as well, so they might have different names in different settings or in different key stages of education, but they are all under similar principles. So for example, to facilitate transitions for very young children, toddlers, who may be entering, for example, early years, there are strategies and plans where the voice of the child can be elicited, the voice of the family, home visits take place so that cultural orientation and needs are shared and understood. There are transition items that can be used, artifacts from particular cultures, so that in that way you can somehow support the linguistic needs and the cultural needs of a child and a family. And it's so important at this young stage to look at the child with their family in the context also of Brenner's ecosystemic model. It's really important to take all needs of learners into consideration as they are entering different stages of education. So for example, then in primary school there might be needs for perhaps interventions that are individualized through inclusion passports, where again you might have, according to the child's particular needs, there might be social needs included, cultural needs, individual needs in terms maybe of certain disabilities or learning differences. It and it's all intersectional. We acknowledge that all these interact with each other, and they are quite systemic. So it's important then not to look at things in the individualized way of those passports or academic support or any way that we choose to call this, but to also think how these inform the practices that the setting and the school at different stages takes on and promotes for all children. So it is key to look at how this is generalized and improves really practice for everyone in an inclusive way.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.